The New Orleans Saints head coach interview request list so far includes a quality that fans desperately needed to see from the organization, and that's names that challenge the status quo. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, the New Orleans Saints have already begun molding their future, bringing back 9 players on reserve future deals. We'll break that down and what other transactions we can expect to see over the coming weeks. We're also going to take a look at Darren Rizzi in his final end of season presser, where he discussed the change that the New Orleans Saints needed, a refreshing narrative for this team. And speaking of refreshing narrative, the New Orleans Saints putting together an interview list at head coach so far that challenges the status quo. Let's discuss who's on the list and why that's important. We got all that coming up for you on today's episode. We appreciate you, whether it's your first time or your next time, for making us your first listen and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where you can get a big return here as the NFL playoffs begin. Just head over to FanDuel.com today. As a new customer, you put $5 down, you can win a $250 back in bonus bets. Go and check that out today at FanDuel.com. So, the New Orleans Saints right now have several names on their interview list. They've requested 5 plus 1 because we know that Darren Rizzi will receive an interview. So the Saints currently have 6 coaches that are on the interview list at the moment, but there's also a rumored couple of names out there that we haven't seen just yet. So first, let's run down the list of the different head coaches that are there, and I'm going to explain to you why I think that this list challenges the New Orleans Saints status quo, and I think that that is a very, very good move for New Orleans. So let's get started here. The New Orleans Saints so far have requested interviews with offensive coordinator Joe Brady with the Buffalo Bills, Philadelphia Eagles offensive coordinator Kellen Moore, Detroit Lions defensive coordinator Aaron Glenn. We certainly expected that one. Miami Dolphins defensive coordinator Anthony Weaver, and New York Giants offensive coordinator / assistant head coach Mike Kafka. Now, I want to also mention that there are 2 others that are rumored in terms of what we're looking at so far. That includes Denver Broncos senior personnel executive David Shaw, although those are conflicting rumors. Jane Slater, NFL reporter, said that she had 2 sources that informed her that the Saints are going to interview David Shaw, who is the current Denver Broncos senior personnel executive, spent some time as the head coach at Stanford for 12 years, worked with guys like Andrew Luck, and she includes Davis Mills. I don't think we have to put Davis Mills' name on this list. But that report also has a conflicting report, and that, of course, would be coming from Nick Underhill, who mentioned that not only do the Saints not have plans to interview David Shaw, but they never had plans to interview David Shaw, and they will not interview David Shaw. So we'll see which way that one ends up going. These are the types of things that happen during this. You start getting reports here, there, everywhere, and all that, but ultimately we'll see what happens. But what I like about what the official requested coaching list is that you've got some guys that have the connective tissue, right? Darren Rizzi, of course, will be in that number, if you will. But you've got Aaron Glenn, the former defensive backs coach. You've got Joe Brady, who spent really just 2 seasons in New Orleans as an offensive assistant. The connective tissue there, I think, is a little bit overblown. I think that if you're interested in Joe Brady, you're interested in Joe Brady because of Joe Brady. I don't think you're interested in Joe Brady because Joe Brady used to be here. You know what I mean? And so, but the connective tissue is absolutely there. But outside of that, the names on the list so far, guys like Mike Kafka, Anthony Weaver, the defensive coordinator with the Miami Dolphins, and then looking at Kellen Moore, offensive coordinator of the Philadelphia Eagles, has also previously been with the Los Angeles Chargers, but really hit the map back in the 2020 range when he hit, when things really started to hit with the Dallas Cowboys as an offensive coordinator. His as a young guy, his name kind of like flew on the scene very quickly, was already in the interviews with as a head coach and all that stuff. Same thing happened with Anthony Weaver last season and everything. So, but what you're seeing with those 3 names is not really a lot of connective tissue. You look at the other names in terms of the David Shaw name that's rumored but not rumored. You look at the Matt Nagy name that's been rumored in the past. Those are also names that don't check the box of the status quo for the New Orleans Saints. So what I like about this list so far is how expansive the search actually is. And this is what we've been saying all along. I know that there's been a lot of reporting out there, and I'll get into this in a second, but there's been a lot of reporting out there that the Saints were going to stick with somebody that Mickey Loomis knows. And that's all fine and dandy, but somebody that he knows and somebody that's been a part of the organization before are two different criteria, right? Like, I can know you even if you've not worked with me before. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that was something that maybe clouded some of the expectations, but we also have to wait and see who the hire is, right? Because if the hire is somebody that he's worked with before, then you're right back in sort of potentially the status quo situation and stuff like that. And the importance of change is certainly big here in 2025, going into 2025. That regular season, but also the ability to change is limited, right? So there's a thin line that you have to walk. And so where you can change things is with your culture, with your leadership, things like that. This head coach interview list so far shows at least a willingness to do that and then begin some of those incremental changes that'll take place over the course of the next few seasons. Now, I started to mention something about kind of the national narrative of, Mickey Loomis will hire somebody that he knows. And the reason why I bring that up is because, interestingly, this feels like the flip side of what happened when Dennis Allen was hired, right? When Dennis Allen was hired, what you saw was the organization saying this is going to be an expansive search, the national media saying this is going to be an expansive search, and then everybody locally going, nah, it's going to be Dennis Allen, right? Like, every one of us was like, look, they're going to interview, here's all the other coaches, here's why these coaches would fit, yada, yada. But also, it's going to be Dennis Allen. Like, we all knew that that's exactly what was going to happen. This time around, the organization is again saying it'll be an expansive search. The national media is saying that it's going to be a focused search and that the hire will be somebody that Mickey Loomis knows. And in the local media saying it's going to be an expansive search. And so we were right last time. So I expect that we'll be right this time to where it will be an expansive search. Now, having an expansive search doesn't necessarily always mean that you hire the guy or the person that's furthest away from your internal criteria, right? So you might still end up with somebody that kind of maintains a little bit of status quo, or at least comes in with the expectation, right, publicly, that he will maintain the status quo, even though they might not maintain the status quo. So the search expansion is a really, really good thing to see so far. And also, you could still end up hiring somebody that doesn't completely flip this thing on its head. So we got to wait and see exactly what it is the New Orleans Saints do. But I like what the Saints have done so far in terms of this search. And you're seeing Darren Rizzi come in as a guy that continues as a candidate that would be not a figurehead, but would be a head coach, non-play caller. Joe Brady would probably call the offense. Kellen Moore would probably call the offense. Aaron Glenn would probably call the defense. Anthony Weaver could go either way, would probably call the defense. Mike Kafka could go either way as well. He's an offensive coordinator and assistant head coach with the New York Giants, but he's not calling plays right now. He called plays 2 years ago, but then Brian Daboll, the head coach, actually took that responsibility away from him beginning in 2024, and that went swell. So, that's sarcastic, right? Sarcastic, double thumbs up on that one. So, I think Kafka could be somebody that could go either way. I think Weaver could be somebody that could go either way in terms of being a play caller, head coach, or just being a head coach. And then Darren Rizzi, of course, would be somebody that would be a head coach. So if you look at that, that's kind of 3 and 3. Guys that would come in and absolutely take over play calling duties, and then guys that would come in and say, I don't necessarily need to take over play calling duties, or might want play calling duties in Anthony Weaver's case. So it's an interesting sort of blend of candidates here. I like the blend of candidates so far. It shows some diversity in background in terms of like some offensive head coaches, some defensive head coaches, some guys with special teams background, all that kind of stuff. So I'm very pro that as well going into the search for New Orleans, because I think you need to look at every possibility. And so far, it looks like the New Orleans Saints, with this beginning list, this list will continue to grow. This beginning list are doing the things that they need to do, which is have that expansive search and not just talk to the people that would maintain the status quo. Coming up next, speaking of not maintaining the status quo, Darren Rizzi was pretty clear that he, even if he were brought back, and with his connective ties previously existing, that he himself would not maintain the status quo going into 2025. Let's get to that next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks, the easiest and most fun way to play daily fantasy sports. It's why it has over 10 million members using the app over at PrizePicks. Here's how it works. It's super simple. PrizePicks takes players that are competing, whether that's in football, basketball, golf, like there's so much on there, and then gives them a projection, a stat projection, like rushing yards or receiving yards or something like that. All you got to do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 players. You're choosing if they're going to come in at more or less than those projections. You get multiple of those right, you can up to 1,000 times your money over at PrizePicks. So let me give you an example. With the playoffs this weekend, Saquon Barkley and the Philadelphia Eagles, Saquon Barkley, more or less than 1 touchdown. You get that right, do that with 2 to 6 other players, and then bang, you're winning real cash. And right now, there's a special offer for our Locked On listeners. All you got to do is download the PrizePicks app and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. You'll get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's $50 instantly with your first $5 lineup. Promo code LOCKEDONNFL at the PrizePicks app. PrizePicks, run your game. All right, family. The New Orleans Saints are officially undergoing their head coach search, and the names continue to be added to the list. One of the names on that list right now, of course, is interim head coach Darren Rizzi, who took over for the New Orleans Saints after the Week 9 firing of former head coach Dennis Allen. And even if Darren Rizzi does return as the New Orleans Saints head coach, he says he's going to bring change, even though he has ties to the previous regime. That's what I want to break down here next, because I do think that this is something you wanted to hear from Darren Rizzi in this situation, right? If the New Orleans Saints were to run things back, let's say, and keep Darren Rizzi, make him their, full-time head coach. Let's say Aaron Glenn goes to the Jets. Let's say Mike Vrabel goes to the Patriots. And then the Saints are kind of looking at these other head coaches and saying, man, we really like what we have in Darren Rizzi just as much as what we like about the potential of the other guys that we don't know as well. Then the Saints could turn around and say, you know what, let's hire Darren Rizzi, keep him in place, make him the full-time head coach, and see what he can do with an offseason and ability to make the changes that he wants to make, to do things differently, as opposed to taking over mid-season and not being able to change a bunch of stuff. And the Saints would be logical in that decision. And ideally for Darren Rizzi, it would be more than just a couple of year thing to get them out of the salary cap situation and into kind of their next era at quarterback and all this other stuff. And then they just end up selling off that product. The New Orleans Saints don't seem like they're that kind of organization. So we'll see how things go if that were to happen. But instead of hiring their 16th ever, franchise head coach, they could just be with their 15th guy and continue to roll ahead. And I think that they would get some pushback on that. And I think that the major pushback would come from the idea that Darren Rizzi is a former Sean Payton staff member. He's the last, really the last remaining Sean Payton staff member outside of like Michael Hodges. Phil Galliano was around and stuff like that. But really as like one of the primary coordinators, right? He's the last remaining guy. Dennis Allen's gone. Pete Carmichael's gone. Darren Rizzi was the only coordinator to survive the cleansing of the Sean Payton era, right? Which happened over the course of the last couple of years. But because of the fact that he is still that last kind of remaining piece of that, of that quartet, if you will, people would expect that this is an example of the New Orleans Saints just trying to recapture the glory days with Sean Payton, recapture the success of the Sean Payton era. And Darren Rizzi made it clear that that would not necessarily be the case if he were to be retained. Now that he's gotten 8 games of experience on a really kind of quick, fast-paced type situation where he didn't get to make all of the changes that he would have wanted to make, he would go into the offseason willing to make changes. And in fact, one of the things that he said to us in yesterday's end-of-season press conference was that changes need to be made. He was very clear about that. And now he couldn't detail with us all the changes that he would make. I'm sure he's going to save that for the interview process, right? He's not interviewing for the job with the media. He's interviewing with the job with the New Orleans Saints. So I get that. But look at the things that he did. I mean, the moment that he was appointed head coach, he effectively demoted a defensive line coach. They won't say it that way, but I will. They demoted a defensive line coach. They also elevated a new defensive line coach in Brian Young. The defensive line immediately got better, didn't get to where you wanted it to get, short on sacks on the season, all that kind of stuff. But and still, struggled in the run game, just dropped further and further in run defense all the way down to second worst in the NFL. But the decision to move on from Todd Grantham felt like a really obvious one, and Darren Rizzi was the one that made that call. And then eventually Grantham got a job with Oklahoma State and went off to go and do that job. But he's the one that made that change. He also made shifts all across the defensive coaching staff in terms of adding different responsibilities, getting Michael Hodges a little bit more involved, getting Marcus Robertson, Joe Woods a little bit more involved. But I think that that's a place where you're going to see a lot of change is over on that defensive side of the coaching staff. You're going to get a new defensive coordinator there. You're going to then see that defensive coordinator bring guys in that they want to work with. And then, look, and I would say that one of the guys to watch out for if Darren Rizzi were to be retained as a potential defensive coordinator would actually be elevating Michael Hodges, the linebackers coach, to defensive coordinator. But I think they'd want to bring in something new from there. But I think Michael Hodges would certainly get that interview. I expect that Michael Hodges will also get interviews elsewhere too. He's been interviewed like every year for additional positions. So I think that like you can see sort of where those changes came down to. Then the other things like adding the dynamic warm up to practices, which is something that feels so obvious, like, yeah, warm up before practice. That makes sense. But it was a specific type of warm up that they did, and they reduced their soft tissue injuries big time. They only had one soft tissue injury in the final 8 games. And one of the things that Darren Rizzi highlighted yesterday was that no players ever cramped up during a game in the final 8 games, which was an issue during the first 9 games under Dennis Allen. And so I think that you can see too where that ends up making a big impact. The Saints only had one soft tissue injury down the stretch. That was Alvin Kamara's groin injury that happened in game, not in practice, which I think is an important delineation as well, because we saw a lot of soft tissue injuries in practice that ended up keeping guys out of games. I think I remember Darren Rizzi saying something like that being like 4, 5, or 6. It was somewhere in that range, like 4 to 6 different players that ended up injured in practice with a soft tissue injury and then missing in the game that weekend. You did not see that for the New Orleans Saints for this 2024 like final stretch of 8 games. So looking at all of the different changes and things like that Darren Rizzi did make after taking over for Dennis Allen, just from the things that we can tell, putting the position groups back together in the locker room, removing the plexiglass dividers in the locker room, creating a more communal space, and creating a little bit more relationship with everybody. The coaches love him. The players love the adjustments that he made. There were some issues. There was some issue taken towards the end of the season about practices and things like that. But looking at how often they're able to actually use those padded practices, only 16 total. They can only use so many in the final 6 games and all those other things. Not a lot of opportunity to, be more physical in practices, but maybe not using all of those early on in the season like the Saints did and saving some of those to where what they can late in the season might have ended up giving them a boost. So looking at all those different changes at practices that he already made, I think you can see where Darren Rizzi would be able to make further changes over the course of this offseason. Certainly you'd like to see stuff in terms of roster personnel changes. I think you're going to see that. There's a lot of talent on this roster. I know it's not going to get a lot of credit for it, but there is a lot of talent on this roster. But the depth just got gutted this past offseason, and I think the Saints need to work on rebuilding that depth and ideally rebuilding more long-term depth so that you're not consistently going back to one-year deals with guys that are like learning your system, spending a year in your system as a depth player, and then having to flip to their next system or coming from another system, and then you're having to retrain it. Stop, string together, long-term depth like they used to, And so I could see Darren Rizzi doing something similar to that, right? So I think that Darren Rizzi would maybe represent a greater holdover of Sean Payton's way than Darren Rizzi would represent holdover of Dennis Allen's way, if that makes sense. And I think that that could be a positive thing. So if the Saints needed to do that, I think that they would still be in a situation to where they would need to embrace change in the process, because Darren Rizzi certainly sounds like he's got things that he wants to shift, change, and do differently if he gets that full-time role. Speaking of names still being added to the list, Adam Schefter just a moment ago tweeting out from ESPN that the Saints are amongst the group that is interested in former Tennessee Titans head coach Mike Vrabel. Nick Underhill tweeting and saying that they are expecting that interview will happen soon. If you've been listening to the show, we've been saying for a while here that you're going to see Mike Vrabel on an interview either this week or next week sometime soon. So I think that you'll be seeing that here down the way. But another name to add to the list that, again, represents a change of the status quo for the New Orleans Saints. Coming up next, the New Orleans Saints are already starting to mold their future when it comes to their personnel as well. Let's take a look at the 9 future reserve contracts that the New Orleans Saints handed out and some additional moves that you could see on the way. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by friends at Gametime, my favorite place to go to get tickets to my favorite events, whether I'm planning moments in advance or months in advance. And let's face it, usually I'm planning moments in advance. Like tonight, I'm considering going to the New Orleans Pelicans and Minnesota Timberwolves game, and the decision is getting a lot easier because tickets over on Gametime are $1. $1. They are a third of the price of Tulane basketball tickets, which are $3 right now over on Gametime. So you can get in on all that action over at Gametime today. We absolutely love Gametime. I use it all the time when we're like out of town and stuff like that to find something spontaneous to go and check out. They let you see views from your seats before you buy the tickets. You can turn on all-in pricing so that there's no surprise fees by the time you get to check out all that. I absolutely love it. Gametime is awesome. Take all the guesswork out of buying tickets by checking out Gametime today. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints are already starting to establish their future with some young guys that are going to come in competing for spots at training camp. They handed out 9 reserve future deals to players. So I want to get to those, break those players down, kind of let you know what to expect from each one of them. Let's define reserve future contracts first. You're going to hear me say reserve future. You're going to hear me say future reserve. It's technically reserve future, but I accidentally flipped through each one because I'm a pain, and I'm sorry about that. But basically, the way that these contracts work is that these are guys on the practice squad that the Saints want to bring back in the 2025 season for OTAs, minicamp, training camp, stuff like that, just to give them an opportunity to compete and to give them an opportunity to potentially land a spot, continue to develop. They like the development process of these players so far, watching them throughout the season. So here's an opportunity to continue that development, continue to deepen that relationship. And to do that, guys in the past that have gotten these future reserve deals include like Carl Granderson, for instance, who ended up becoming obviously a big part of what the New Orleans Saints do. I believe JT Gray was a reserve future guy at one point when he came in initially as a UDFA and stuff like that. So as the practice squad has continued to grow and you have not only rookies coming into your practice squad or really, really young guys coming onto your practice squad, you've also got veterans coming onto the practice squad. And you're going to see one veteran name on this list as well that the Saints are bringing back. There's a specific reason for that. But let's go through the list here real quick. Defensive end, Ryder Anderson. Safety, Millard Bradford, who was a part of this year's UDFA rookie class. Offensive tackle, Josiah Aziram, who was drafted in the 7th round of this year's draft class. Defensive back, Trey Fluelin. That's somebody that joined midseason. Tight end, Michael Jacobson, who's been around for a while. He was a future reserve guy in previous years. Kicker Charlie Smith is back from Ireland, running back X Valaday, and then tight end Trayton Welsh, who came in this year as well. The veteran name on the list, though, is quarterback Ben DiNucci, which is really, really interesting to see. I think maybe that's a part of just making sure you've got enough quarterbacks for things like rookie mini camps and stuff like that. Make sure you have enough guys because Derek Carr is not going to be a part of rookie mini camps, right? Jake Hayner has been around long enough for he doesn't have to be at rookie minicamps, but Spencer Rattler could be at rookie minicamps, but doesn't necessarily need to be. And so having a guy like Ben DiNucci that can come in and kind of be, this offseason, the Saints had brought in a couple of different veterans to help as passers and stuff like that. And so this could be another one of those situations where he comes back, helps out rookie minicamps, mandatory minicamps, all those kinds of things. So just an interesting kind of note there for Ben DiNucci to be sticking around. Going down the list here, defensive end, Ryder Anderson. You didn't get to see a lot of him over the course of the season. He was somebody that was utilized a lot on scout teams, special teams, all that kind of stuff in practices. Was a core practice player for this team that gives you an opportunity to continue to do that. He understands the culture, how the practices are done, all that. So I think that that's part of the reasoning there. He also fits the mold of a New Orleans Saints defensive end. He's big, he's tall, he's all those types of things. Big lumbering, not lumbering, but a big giant type of guy. Safety Millard Bradford was a part of this year's UDFA class. He came in as somebody with kind of these ball hawking tendencies, for TCU. Made a lot of plays on the ball all throughout training camp and mini camps and stuff like that. Didn't get a ton of opportunity on defense here in the regular season, but did get elevated for this final game and a couple of games throughout the year to help out on special teams. Offensive tackle Josiah Aziram, remember that was a guy that we talked about from the moment that he was drafted, that he was going to be a multi-year guy. He's so happy to be back. Like, this is entirely like a dream come true for him to even so much as get a deal. I was talking to him in the locker room during cleanup and stuff like that. He was just so excited about the fact that he gets to come back. You know what I mean? And like that, this is just kind of his dream. And so he's just pumped. And it's awesome. I don't know if you saw the draft video of him. If you didn't see the video of him being drafted, just search like Josiah Aziram draft video and just watch how absolutely pumped this dude was to be selected in the draft. Defensive back Trey Flulen was an interesting one because the NFL actually disapproved his contract because he never actually signed a rookie deal, and he is a rookie. And so because he joined as somebody that was drafted to the UFL past offseason and all this stuff, and he joined midseason, he never really signed a rookie contract. He just kind of came in on a practice squad deal. And so the Saints, instead of giving him a 2-year rookie contract, or excuse me, 2-year reserve future contract, which is kind of typical, they had to give him a 3-year reserve future contract. So that's why you saw something about the NFL disapproving that deal. Not a big deal. Tight ends Michael Jacobson, Trayton Welsh, both of those guys just continue to develop. Michael Jacobson impresses every training camp. Will he get an opportunity to continue to develop and potentially even work his way into the active roster throughout the season? There's an injury now at tight end. We'll see what happens exactly when it comes to Foster Moreau, but Aircast came out dealing with a knee injury, not sounding good, certainly is sounding like it's going to be surgical. And so with that being the case, we'll see what that means for his return timeline for training camp and stuff like that. So you got a pair of tight ends that are coming back. Kicker Charlie Smith gets a 3-year deal. He's somebody, and I think it was actually Michael McQuaid from over at NFL UK in Ireland that actually broke that. And so, or has done a lot of work with the kid from Ireland, actually broke that early yesterday. So Charlie Smith coming back on a 3-year deal. So more competition for Blake Grupe, who still had a good season this year, kicked in, nailed over 80% of his field goals, over 90% of his extra points. Was a perfect 4 of 4 to end the season up against the who did they play the last week? Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I'm already moved on to the offseason against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So I think Blake Grupe ultimately is pretty safe in terms of his outlook, but he's definitely going to have competition with Charlie Smith, who's got the leg in terms of distance, just needs to continue to work on the accuracy in terms of the shorter, area kicks and stuff like that. So if he's got the leg and the accuracy from far away, and he continues to improve the leg and accuracy close, there's going to be some competition, I think, there again. Running back Validate, man, I can't tell you a guy in the locker room that is more in love with the city of New Orleans that has spent the least amount of time in New Orleans, right? Like, there's those guys like Cam Jordan and Alvin Kamara who aren't from here but love the city to death, right? Validate loves the city to death and has been around for like half a season. Like, it's incredible. So he's a really cool one. He's going to be a fun one to watch. He's got a lot of juice in terms of the way that he runs and everything like that. And so he'll be somebody that gets to come back and compete in camp, but he wants to do more within the community and stuff like that too. So don't be surprised if you hear Validate's name a lot off the field as he returns to New Orleans during training camps and all that kind of stuff, mini camps, OTAs, and stuff like that, just as much as you hear about how he's doing on the field. I think he's going to be doing a lot of really great work, which is super exciting to hear. Because again, you know the rule, right? You love New Orleans and New Orleans loves you back. So Validate is somebody that's certainly checking that box right now, which is pretty cool to see. So those are the guys that you can expect to see back in the 2025 kind of off-season, OTAs, mini camps, all that other stuff. I wanted to wrap up here, save a little bit of extra time for any kind of late breaking news while I'm recording. We do have a couple of updates for you in terms of head coaching search. Nothing too big, but still something to keep an eye out on here. We mentioned that the New Orleans Saints requested to interview Aaron Glenn. It seems that request has been granted. He's expected to begin his interviews, according to Ian Rappaport over at NFL Network, Thursday through Saturday is kind of what he's going to do. Now, the Lions have a bye week, and so he's interviewing with 4 of the 5 open head coaching job teams, basically everybody but the Patriots at the moment. He's going to be interviewing for 4 of the 5 jobs: the Jets, the Saints, the Bears, and the Jaguars. That's all going to happen from Thursday, Friday, and Saturday is kind of what that's going to be. So that's what you can expect there. All of those interviews will be virtual. You're going to hear this a lot for coaches that are currently coaching in the playoffs. They're going to be virtual interviews. It's required to be. It's required to be. The Saints and no other NFL team will be able to interview a coordinator that's currently coaching in the playoffs until after the 19th of January and after they've been eliminated from the playoffs. So both of those thresholds have to be met before in-person interviews can begin. So that's what to expect when it comes to Aaron Glenn. And we can already say here too that the Jets are going to be interviewing virtually Matt Nagy. Remember, Matt Nagy is a name that was connected to the New Orleans Saints through Diana Rossini. So expect to hear more about Matt Nagy coming up too. But the Saints won't be the only one that will be taking a look at Matt Nagy, it looks like. All right. In tomorrow's episode, we'll keep you updated on everything you need to know about this head coaching search. Bonus episodes, I'm sure, are going to be on the way as well with any breaking news. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. If you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.